90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today we're continuing our series on laws involving pandemic issues, and today we're going to talk about COVID, residency, and tax issues. Our guest is Karen Tenenbaum. She is the leader of the most prominent firm on Long Island and possibly New York City and state dealing with tax residency issues, and they're that much more important concerning COVID. Karen, welcome back to Law You Should Know.
Thanks, Ken, for having me.
Now, you deal with residency issues all the time, in good times and bad. Why are they that much more important and complex in the era of COVID?
So in a recent article, it's entitled, "Nearly half of NYC's top earners have considered fleeing the city." So many people who worked from home during lockdown moved out of New York City to live with their parents, either in another state, or went to their vacation home, for example, in the Hamptons. And that could be temporary or permanently. And they don't realize that they may owe taxes in more than one place. It could be two states, and they may have a credit or not be entitled to a credit. In the end, they may have double taxation.
And they may also have New York City taxes, depending on if one house is outside the city and one is in the city.
Exactly. New York City has an extra almost 4% tax. And so we got calls on a regular basis from people who have a New York City apartment and a job in New York City historically. And now they were sheltering in place in the Hamptons. And they only wanted to know, do they still owe taxes to New York City? And what they don't realize is that there's a bigger picture.
So just as you were starting to tell us, what are some of those other issues if they moved temporarily to another state or even another country?
Right. So there's something called, well, we could get into this a little bit later about telecommuting. There's something called the convenience of the employer rule. And so that might create double taxation if you moved temporarily to, let's say, Connecticut, or another state. Usually you get a credit for the tax on earned income. So if you work in New York, you pay tax in New York if you're domiciled here and you're a resident here, and we'll go into those rules in a minute. But if you work somewhere else, they could tax you there as well. And usually you get a credit in your home state for on earned income. However, there are many different states and many different rules, and not every one has the same credit. Also, if you spend more than 183 days in a state, you may be deemed a resident of that state as well. You might have dual residency, and you might not get a full credit in either state.
So those days, I know from talking to you on prior shows, those dates, that number is so important. And it's important almost like people count the days. So while there's still time to do planning, and let's say they're at 170 days, either in New York or away from New York, what are their concerns going forward?
So I laugh because most people think the rule is 6 months in a day. So, but that's not the only rule. That rule relates to residency. So let's go back to what we're talking about. New York State taxes you on all of your income, no matter where it's earned, if you are domiciled here or deemed a statutory resident. So before you get to look at the 6 months in a day rule, which relates to statutory residency, you really have to focus on, are you domiciled here? Now, if you've always historically lived here and you're claiming that you moved out, you have the burden of proof by clear and convincing evidence that you moved to some other location.
When you say moved, you mean permanently or for that tax year?
Right. So you have to, in your heart, Home is where the heart is. Where do you intend to have your permanent residence? So a lot of people claim they moved to Florida. You know, we deal with snowbirds all the time. Their golf buddies told them, hey, you're really here. You're here 6 months and a day. But guess what? That's not the rule. And I always say, raise your hand. You know, I give a presentation, raise your hand if you think you know where you live. And then at the end of the presentation, after I've given all the complex rules, I'll ask the question again. And you see the puzzled look on a lot of people's faces because now they're not so sure where they live.
And this is a very complex issue, aside from the number of days. And that's why people need to do some planning before the end of the year. And they need to speak to someone like you so they put their best foot forward or the best residency forward. So what are some of the options for a person to prevent being taxed in two states, to try to prevent, let's say, higher New York state taxes, etc.?
Yeah, so you're allowed to move for any reason. Usually there's a triggering event. You got married, you got divorced, you retired, you had a health issue. This year might be COVID. But there's usually a specific date on which you claim that you moved. And again, if you are claiming that you changed your domicile, now you have to show it's a subjective intent, but you have to use objective factors. So New York State has come up with 5 objective factors. One is your home. And this is a comparison of where you originally lived, let's say New York, compared to where you're claiming you lived. So they're going to compare the size and the use of the house. They're going to look at your business ties. Were you actively involved in a business on a day-to-day basis in New York originally? Now what? Do you have a home? A business somewhere else? Do you have an office somewhere else? Are you earning income somewhere else? So that's business involvement. They're going to look at that day count, but that's not the 6 months and a day rule. This is, again, a comparison of what you did before to what your new pattern of life is. They're also going to look at your items near and dear. These could be items that are sentimental to you, or it could be things that are valuable to you. And we also call it the pet rule, the dog rule. Where's your dog? Where do you keep your dog? And when you go on vacation and you leave that dog in a kennel, where is that kennel located? And the last factor of the primary factors is where are the family connections? Usually this relates to the minor children. Where do the minor children go to school? And certainly during COVID, that adds a number of different issues because you could be distance learning. So again, are these changes temporary or permanent? You have to leave one place and actually land in another.
And so do people also have to keep track of days or time? And do they want to avoid that 183 days in New York? Does that trigger certain allegations or tax burdens?
Right. So going back so we've been discussing the domicile rules. Now we're going to switch to the statutory residency rules for a moment. So that's the 183-day rule. You have to have a permanent place of abode in New York and spend more than 183 days here. So what you see is, again, you have the burden of proof, and New York State's very aggressive. They subpoena your cell phone records, and they subpoena they ask for your credit card records, your Easy Pass, and often some of those cell phone records are not reliable. They're not accurate. They're pinging off a tower that may be the strongest signal, not the nearest signal. So if you're driving from New Jersey or Connecticut to New York, it could be pinging off a tower on Long Island. And what you see is when we followed them, every 5 minutes they pinged off a different tower. So sometimes it looks like you're in New Jersey, and sometimes it looks like you're in New York, and sometimes it looks like you're in Connecticut, and sometimes it looks like you're in New York. So
and is the burden on the taxpayer to prove they did not set foot in New York physically with their 2 feet?
The day count is, yeah. So what a lot of people do is they have an app. There are a number of different apps that you could find that keep track of your days automatically. And that's based on a GPS system, which is more reliable than pinging off towers. So I think even Google Maps shows exactly where you've been. So
the government may be tracking us that way. Could you keep a paper diary, which might provide with a little more flexibility?
Sure. So a lot of people do keep paper diaries, or they'll have a secretary keep track of where they are. But usually New York State wants documentary evidence supporting that. So they might look at those credit card records to see, did you charge something on those days? And usually if there's nothing on the calendar anywhere, they assume it's a New York day, unless it's something like you live so far away that you couldn't possibly. So let's say you're one place on a Friday and one place on a Sunday, but there's no indication of where you are on the Saturday. If you're so far away, you could probably convince.
So you want receipts or restaurant receipts or store receipts or gas receipts that show you in another state.
Right.
So you need at least a receipt per day.
But sometimes there are false positives. So, for example, let's say you get a newspaper or a magazine delivered automatically to a location, and it's charged on your credit card on the same date every month. There's a possibility that New York State will say, "Oh, you bought the paper," but you have to go through it and say, "No, I didn't buy the paper. It's automatically charged."
And you might want to have those credit card bills go to a different state.
Exactly. You want to change a lot of addresses.
So you have to be a little detective, because they have their detectives. You need to do your planning.
Now let's just go back to the factors for a minute. So most people aren't focused on those 5 factors, as I mentioned. They think it's all about changing your driver's license or your voter registration or where you actually vote. But really, those are secondary. They're considered others. And then there are certain factors that aren't relevant at all. You're allowed to have a professional in any state you want.
And what about property tax exemption? If you have an apartment that's rent controlled or rent stabilized, if you're claiming the homeowner exemption in New York or somewhere else, does that suggest you're a New York resident?
Well, again, you want to be consistent in everything you do. So you don't want to take any exemptions that say that you're a resident in New York when you're going to claim that you're not a resident. Well, we see sometimes, don't laugh, people try to save $5 on a fishing license. You know, they get they get a resident fishing license. No, I'm sorry. They claim they live in another state, and in that other state, they get a non-resident fishing license. And then New York State says, wait a minute, what is that all about?
So you want that, if you want to be domiciled in another state, you want residency stuff in another state.
You want your pattern of life to change. So we recently spoke to somebody who bought a place in Florida many years ago, spent the first year renovating it, and New York State came in the second or third year after that and said, we don't think you really moved, we think you're here, and sent that guy a bill for $250,000. When we were chatting, I said, I don't know what's going to be, we have to look at the paperwork from the past, but you could certainly try and change it in this current year. And the person said, well, I have to say I was stuck in Florida. Usually I'm October till May. This time I was October till July. But now I'm back in New York, and my wife doesn't want to leave because the grandchildren are here. Okay, well, guess what? If you're not really changing your pattern of life, you're going to have a problem when it comes to proving to New York State that you moved.
Are you going to carve out the COVID exception that you couldn't travel back to New York? New York would not let you come back in. You had to do it for your own health or had a doctor's note?
Right. So that's
your mind and spirit were in New York, but they wouldn't let you come back?
So that's a great argument. Look, it helps that you were stuck in Florida if you're trying to prove that you were there. But what happens if you were stuck here? Let's say you had someone who was sick and you were here or an elderly relative and you were here to watch them. I don't see that New York State is going to be so lenient. I'm doing this for 37 years, and although sometimes they're more receptive to these kinds of arguments than others, this time I don't see it being an argument and they've been very silent on this point. So I think
that could
New
be
York
the
State
snowbird.
should have hindsight.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
That could be the snowbird who normally goes to Florida and spends more than half the year in Florida, but because of medical issues or safety issues, they can't get on a plane. So they're hostage in New York. Right,
and so you still have time because if you were in Florida again till July, you still have time to now move back to Florida perhaps a little earlier than you normally would have. You still have the rest of the year, and you can show that your day count is more in Florida because that's one of the factors that they look at.
Can you cross over to New Jersey a couple of times to stop the count in New York? Take a couple overnight trips to Connecticut or New Jersey to get out of town?
Well, again, are we talking about domicile? Because if you're domiciled here, you're taxed here no matter what the day count is. That's it. You're here. And there are certain exceptions when we're looking at statutory residency rules. If it's just traveling through New York, or if you're here as an inpatient in a hospital, your days don't count for that purpose. However, a spouse who is here, those days do count. And husband and a wife can have separate tax returns and can have separate day counts. But you want the moneyed spouse to be able to prove that they're out.
Okay, very, very good information. We'll continue our discussion on residency tax issues, especially during COVID, with our expert Karen Tenenbaum, who is the Long Island tax attorney, and as you can see, an expert in this field. We're going to talk more about planning for this year as we go ahead to the end of the year and for next year, so you can establish the residency that's beneficial to you for tax purposes. I just want to remind our listeners, you're listening to Law You Should Know on 90.3 FM. The podcast of this program, in case you missed part of it or want to tell others about it, is at nccradio.org. So Karen, just going forward, there's a few weeks left in the year and start planning for next year. Let's say you're an employee or something, but you're allowed to work from home. What kind of discussion do you want to have with your boss? If you had a CEO, what kind of discussion do you want to have with your controller? Right.
So again, telecommuting has been a big issue because there's something called the convenience of the employer rule. So let's say you got over the hurdle of domicile and you got over the hurdle of statutory residency. You might still be taxed in New York based on this rule because it's based on where your employer is located, where you historically went to the office. So you could be in another state and still be taxed in New York unless it's the type of job that could only be done there for whatever reason. You're at a manufacturing plant to visit. But you could be taxed in more than one state.
But what if there's no more office? The offices closed down, as many offices in Manhattan are, or Long Island offices might. Right. And there's people breaking leases. They don't want space. Workers don't want to have to travel. Should they get a post office box in New Jersey? Should they have no workplace? Just everyone works from where there is? They work it up in the sky somewhere?
So it's going to be interesting to see that because I don't know that there's a clear answer at the moment. Right now, you are taxed where your office historically was. Whether that continues going forward will be interesting.
Now, just as big companies do, billion-dollar companies set up a P.O. box in some state, no tax state, or Florida or some other country. Could some company do that to help their employees maximize their residency issues?
Well, that might create issues for them because that might create a nexus in that state, causing them to pay.
What if it's on a boat outside the jurisdiction?
So I wrote an article that's published in the Journal of Financial Planning, and we also have what we call the top 10 COVID reasons that relate to New York State tax residency. So if anyone is interested in getting a copy of these articles, you could either get them on my website, litaxattorney.com, or you could email me at taxhelpline@litaxattorney.com, or you could always call my office at 631-465-5000, and that's Tenenbaum Law.
And you give programs for many business groups on this issues, and you also are on the cutting edge of all those issues. And these services these issues can have tremendous consequences to individuals or to companies or to the executive workers at a company.
And what we also offer is we have a free app. You could download Tax Helpline on either platform, and we'll give you a free 15-minute consultation. And it has great links, COVID-related and non-COVID related, to the IRS and New York State websites. So what you'll see is, right now we're talking about residency, but there are a lot of other collection issues. Let's say you couldn't afford to pay your taxes and you don't want them taking money out of your bank account or your salary, and you might need an offer in compromise, which is paying less than the full amount, or you may need an installment agreement. There are links. Some of these things you could do online, and there are links from my app right to IRS and New York State's websites. And it could be very beneficial sometimes to see if you qualify and to see what the rules are in advance.
Now, in a worst-case scenario where someone's been snagged up for maybe inappropriately by one of these tax authorities, you can go to work and defend them and negotiate and litigate and appeal these issues.
What a lot of people don't realize is that if you owe $10,000 or more to New York State, they could take away your driver's license. And a lot of people say, I don't care, I'll get a license in another state. But most states have a reciprocal agreement. I think there's only 5 states that are not part of that agreement. So you're not going to get a driver's license anywhere else. If you live on Long Island, you need a license to drive. And with respect to the IRS, if you owe more than $53,000, they could take away your passport. Now, maybe that's not as important right now because you can't travel as much, but you'd be surprised how you're going to need that.
And also, there could be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake. So it's usually worthwhile for someone to consult with you or to retain you to litigate these issues, to maximize their losses, to put them in the best possible shape going forward.
I'm going to tell you another example of what recently happened. Somebody in New York clearly lived in New York, bought a place in Florida about 6 months or a year before he was planning on selling his New York business, sold it for a lot of money, entered into a consulting agreement to remain available, not necessarily in New York, but remain available for a number of years, and then claimed that he didn't owe the taxes to New York State. Well, New York State sent him a bill for a lot of money, a lot of money. And when he went to deal with the audit and the auditor, he gave away too much information on his own and with his accountant. And now we're in the process of negotiating a better deal.
So the moral of the story is see a lawyer first for the planning and for the representation. I think it's Abe Lincoln who said only a fool, an attorney, someone who represents themselves has a fool for an attorney.
I think the moral really is know the rules. And if you don't know the rules, then don't answer any questions directly with the government. Because years ago we represented somebody and they interviewed the wife. And the wife said, oh, my children are in middle school and I'm not taking them out of school yet. Oh, really? So that shows that you don't have an intention of really moving to another state. You're staying here.
But they always have options available. So you want to make sure that they put themselves create the best possible scenario and circumstances. I just want to remind our listeners, we're talking with Karen Tenenbaum. She's the head of Tenenbaum Law, tax attorneys, representing taxpayers in IRS and New York State tax matters. And as you know, she's very knowledgeable. We're going to get some additional information from her, and she'll give you her website again. You're listening to Law You Should Know on 90.3. And also for the podcast of this and many other law shows, go to nccradio.org.
The key really is documentation. You want to keep track of your days, as you mentioned, and you want to make sure that you have moving bills, that you use the moving company, because honestly, that's the one document that shows the day you moved. Now, a lot of people say, oh, I could afford brand new furniture and brand new clothes. Yes, but it's very important to show we moved something of, again, sentimental value or monetary value from here to there, and maybe even change your insurance policies as well on those items. But you can contact us again at litaxattorney.com or write to us at taxhelpline@litaxattorney.com or call us at 631-465-5000.
And also whatever receipts you have or documentation, your library card, your driver's license, your dining receipts, your shopping receipts, where your packages were sent. These are all going to help you establish residency where you want it to be.
Sometimes we come in with photos to show that the 1-year-old had a birthday party somewhere else.
Or your photos show you on the beach in Florida.
Exactly.
Any other final do's and don'ts you can share with our listeners?
So let's see. We've been talking about knowing the rules for domicile and how to change it. Again, it's not just the driver's license and the voter registration. It's all of these other things that we discussed. It's important to know that when you, even after you get over that hurdle and you've proven that you moved somewhere else, then you still have to prove the day count that you're not a statutory resident, dealing with permanent place of abode and more than 183 days. And again, that could even be your vacation home. So you could have a home in the Hamptons and an apartment or work in the city, and you could have spent time in the Hamptons and time in the city, and that's enough to put you over the day count. So you have to watch that. There's a famous case of a guy who earned a lot of money, lived in Connecticut, had a vacation home in the Hamptons, but had an office in the city, and he ended up having to pay $1 million plus penalties because he didn't check the box that he had living quarters in New York. So then once you overcome the domicile rules and you overcome the statutory residency rules, there's these allocation of income rules which relate to telecommuting and New York source income.
So it's a very complicated situation. So if someone's starting a job, if they're recreating their job, if they're returning to a physical workspace, if they have a lot of money at stake, they should consult with you to see so they can put themselves in the best possible posture for accounting for their taxes.
Right. New York State will have the benefit of hindsight, so they're not going to look at you right this second. They're going to look at you next year, the year after, and they're going to know whether you did this temporarily or permanently, all these moves that you're claiming that you made.
But is each year considered separately, or they look at a pattern in past year and future years?
So domicile, once it's determined, is that until it changes. And statutory residency is a day count every single year.
And again, these are very complicated issues. You've heard many of the pitfalls, and it's very important you plan for this year, you plan for the future, and you defend yourself against any tax lawsuits from past years.
And what makes it more complicated is that every state has a different rule.
And these you've been dealing with these issues for many years, but they're that much more complicated because of COVID.
Someone once said, "Is being a tax attorney an interesting job?" And I said, "Oh my God, it's like being on a soap opera every day when you hear some of these crazy stories."
And I know your slogan is, Karen, that you make taxes less taxing.
Thank you.
Just give us your contact information, your website, where our listeners can find a lot of this information again.
Sure. So I'm Karen Tenenbaum, Tenenbaum Law in Melville. The phone number is 631-465-5000. The website is litaxattorney.com. And if you want to email us, it's taxhelpline@litaxattorney.com. And if you download the app, we'll give you a free 15-minute consultation. And write to us if you want any of these articles.
And many of them are on your website as well. And I just would like to thank Karen Tenenbaum. As you know from what she said, she's the leading Long Island tax attorney and in the city too, and deals with these issues every day. And if you missed any part of this program or you want to hear it again, just listen to the shows at nccradio.org for the podcast. And please join us next week at this same time on another show of Law You Should Know.